because I want to talk about something that doesn't get a whole lot of attention. And that is the way people use JavaScript. And more particularly, the way people use third-party JavaScript. It's something that I think is vitally important, but something that doesn't get a whole lot of mention. In fact, when I was doing my prep for this talk and doing research, I found one other paper written on the subject. So clearly it's something to me that I think is important. My job is to convince you that this is also important. One of the reasons I'm doing this is professionally what I do is I write a lot of parsers and screen scrapers because I write a lot of botnets, and I write these distributed networks that collect information for competitive intelligence reasons, sometimes law enforcement. Currently I'm working with some investors. So I get to download a lot of people's web pages, and I get to look at a lot of code. I also did a JavaScript survey. I looked at the 1,000 top websites to see how they are using JavaScript. And that reconfirmed some of my suspicions. Okay, what are we going to discuss? We're going to look at how people are using third-party JavaScript files. And what I mean by third-party JavaScript is when you include JavaScript into your application that comes from a domain that you don't control. I'm going to look at how this can be used as an attack vector by hackers. I've got some examples I'm going to show you. And then I'm also going to show you how you can mitigate this whole process and you can actually safely use JavaScript. The one thing that I really want to make certain that you know is that I do not view JavaScript as the problem. The problem is the way people use JavaScript. One of the ways to gain an appreciation for how JavaScript can be used as an attack vector is to look at specifically what you can do with JavaScript. And there's basically two things that you can do with JavaScript. One of them is monitor or control or modify the document object model, right? For example, this is what a lot of the JavaScript frameworks like jQuery do. The other thing JavaScript can do is talk to other servers. An example of this would be Google Analytics, right? You just load it on the page and it calls the mothership. And lately, it's been getting more important too because there's a trend with malware and they're really going after money. As you can see here, banking Trojans have become very, very popular. And this is a year ago, this is somewhat current. This is the most current statistics I could find. The point is that there are over 40,000 pieces of known JavaScript malware. Okay, these are the ones we know about. And if you're curious, you can go on GitHub and you can download them and play with them if you want. Or if you find a new one, you could probably submit it here. But this is a problem. There's a ton of malware out there. Other people have done studies and they've concluded that 7% of all websites have some kind of malware or an exploit that is related to JavaScript. Okay, what do I mean by third-party JavaScript? This is one example. This is a remote example. And you notice here, what we're doing is we are accessing a JavaScript file off of a domain that we do not control, okay? Sometimes people will take the JavaScript and they'll download it to their own server. But if it's JavaScript that you personally didn't write, or somebody on your team didn't write, I still consider that to be third-party JavaScript. So there's two issues that I see primarily. The first one is if you're doing either of those two things that I just referred to as third-party JavaScript, you are violating proper source control. A quick review here. Source control assumes that you validate your production software. Okay, that's kind of the whole purpose behind source control. That the software that you have out there on your server is validated and it's ready for production use. It assumes that you freeze your code before validation. It assumes that your code hasn't changed during validation and that you only release production quality software. I think there might be something generational going on here. I would ask for a raise of hands, but I can't see hands anyway. How many people in this room have done software development that was not in any way related to the internet? Wow. I think I saw maybe 6 hands come up. See, I think this might be the problem right here. Before I got into web dev, back in the early 90s, I was working on implantable medical devices, okay? So these were pacemakers, defibrillators, and we took things like source control and validation really, really personally, because there were lives at stake. And we were heavily regulated by the EU, and back in the States, the FDA, and source control and validation had probably more meaning than they have for people who have only done web stuff. And I think it's something that I think people kind of lost track of. Oh, by the way, in addition to source control, version control is also part of this, right? Being able to revert back to known good versions of software. Okay, the other problem, and I just touched on it a little bit earlier, is that most people, when they use a third-party library like this, they never validate it, right? So it's resonating with a few people. You know, you're using jQuery and you finally got the calendar to work just the way you want it. You're done, right? You got it working. That is a problem. Okay, JavaScript is hard to validate, right? I mean, a lot of times it's kind of obfuscated. You can't really tell what it's doing. And if you're concerned about it doing things like talking to servers that you're not familiar with, you really need to sit there with some network tools and monitor what your stuff is doing. And I'm guessing that nobody does that. In general, web apps are hard to validate for a lot of reasons, because you don't control people's browser, so things can break. For example, I was doing an application maybe about 10 years ago, and I had it running and I was really happy, and I worked all weekend, I mean literally all weekend on this thing to get it released. Monday morning, I started getting all kinds of complaints from our Moscow office, not because the software wasn't working, but because the software didn't work in Opera. And, you know, I'm from the States, nobody uses Opera in the States, and I had a bug. I had a bug that I didn't catch because I didn't control the software that it was running on. You also don't control the hardware. So it might work fine on your Mac with your 50-inch display, but on your phone, maybe not. Also, web apps can operate very differently if the user has, say, 20 tabs open and they're all running very big Google spreadsheets, right? So web apps are hard to validate, I will give you that. And you can say, okay, because of that, the web is just unique, and what you're saying doesn't really apply to me, right? You might say, hey, source control, we've got an agile office here. We don't need source control. Well, you do. I'm currently working in an agile environment, and we very definitely validate code, and we very definitely exercise source control. Or you might say that there's just nothing mission critical on our website. Nothing's mission critical. It's just a brochure, right? Well, I want to introduce you to my friend up here. This is a little Trojan called You Are an Idiot. And all it does is it just replicates itself. If I had the sound on, you could hear it. It actually sings to you. And the more of these windows that get opened, the bigger the chorus is. This is kind of a fun little thing. But clearly, if this is your corporate website, you don't want some rogue Trojan running around on it, right? So every piece of software that you put out on the internet is important, okay? You don't need stuff like this. Okay, like I was saying, you always want to be able to release valid code. You want code that is going to work reliably. And in fact, you could say that the more important your software is, the more important it is to exercise proper source control and to validate your code. And again, that's obvious if you're doing an e-commerce site or if you're doing a governmental site where people are doing things that are important. But even if you're just doing a brochure site, even if just a one-page corporate website with your name and phone number and address on it, it's still important. One of the problems that you deal with, though, and I understand this, is that these libraries are so attractive. They're very attractive. You got all these great frameworks like jQuery, Angular, React. You don't want to write this stuff on your own. You really don't. And it's just so much easier to use somebody else's code. Same is true, Google's got a bunch, Analytics, Chart, AdSense, Maps. Chart, by the way, is my favorite one. I love Chart. And then you've got other APIs, ad networks, drawing programs. In my survey, I saw a ton of content delivery network type of things. And again, we use these libraries and we assume that they're all fully debugged. We assume that the admins use proper source and version control. And we also assume that they are completely 100% free of any exploit whatsoever, right? And in a lot of cases, when you're using something, for example, jQuery, if you're using jQuery, jQuery is incredibly powerful. So you might just have a few lines of code that you wrote, and you're using thousands of lines of jQuery. So the amount that you contribute is sometimes very, very small compared to what these libraries contribute. Okay, so I did a survey of 1,000 websites to see just how people are using JavaScript. What I did is I looked at a list of Google's list of top 1,000 websites. I don't know what their criteria was. I don't know if it was the most searched for or if it shows up in their analytics. I have no idea. But the list looked pretty representative to me. And I just looked at the home pages. I didn't go any further than that. Maybe someday I will, and I suspect it would uncover other things. I also didn't include when a piece of JavaScript imports another piece of JavaScript. I didn't bother doing that either. So it's pretty cursory what I was doing here. This is actually where I got it from. I didn't get it from Google. I got it from the website here. And it's a nice international list of, I would say, top 1,000 websites. Again, I don't know the criteria that was used to gather this. So anyway, here's what the bot found. I wrote this bot, I downloaded all these pages, did some analysis, and out of the 1,000 websites that I looked at, there were over 4,000 unique pieces of JavaScript that were imported into these home pages. Okay, that's a lot of JavaScript. It's a lot of JavaScript. Nearly 75% of all the websites were doing this. Of those sites that were importing JavaScript, they imported an average of 6.5 JavaScript files. So here's something to think about. Many of these are open source projects, and if we use that as the model, and if we just assume that there are between, I'm guessing maybe 5 and 10 contributors to each one of these, if you're importing like 7 JavaScript files, you're relying on the skills of anywhere from 35 to 70 developers that you don't know. And you don't know how well this stuff is validated. You don't know anything about their source control, all right? 2 of the websites that I looked at imported over 100 JavaScript files. Can you believe that? They imported over 100. And these weren't conditional includes or anything. These all got included. So if you went to these websites, your browser is busy downloading all these JavaScript files. 60% of the websites used a third-party JavaScript from another domain. This does not include the ones that downloaded the code and put it on their own server. They were actually relying on this other domain, all right? So there's all kinds of problems when you do that. First, you're relying on their source control. You don't know when they change the software. Maybe they get hacked. Maybe somebody changes those files. Maybe there's a DNS problem. Maybe there was some DNS poisoning and you've been redirected to a different file. You don't know. You absolutely don't know. And 60% of the websites did this. 600 out of 1,000 were doing this, okay? Does this trouble anybody? This is the kind of stuff that troubles me. What are people using? Well, nearly half of the sites that were using JavaScript were using jQuery. That doesn't surprise me. React and Angular, I'm kind of surprised that they didn't show better than they did, but they did. And keep in mind too, this was just the home page. You go deeper into the website, I'm sure you would find other things. A lot of people use Google AdSense. I think it's kind of bad to use that on your home page. I don't know how you feel about that. But again, this was just the home page, so if you went in deeper, I'm sure you'd find other things. Okay, just a little history lesson here, just to drive home exactly what's going on here. And again, here's where I think there might be some generational stuff that's different. I'm 58 years old, and I've been developing for the web for, well, since the early 90s. You can do the math yourself. So my approach to software might be a little bit different than somebody who's been doing this for 3 or 4 years. And back in 95, this is the last year before JavaScript came out. JavaScript, I believe, was released on December 9th, 1995 by Netscape. I believe that's true. And at the time, you just did a page request and maybe you downloaded some images after you got the HTML, but this was it. This was how the internet worked in 1995. I don't even think there were Java applets at that time. But things worked. You know, Amazon was around. You could still buy things. In fact, I would say most of what we do today, probably 95% of it could be done in this kind of a paradigm. That's not to say that what we're doing now is bad, because I like JavaScript. In fact, my presentation was done on Google Slides, and I'm assuming that the whole front end is some pretty complex JavaScript. So now today we've got a situation that's much more dynamic. You still do a page request, you still get HTML back, you still download images, maybe a little Flash or something. But now, 60% of the websites that I looked at in the top 1,000 also go off someplace on the internet, and they grab code and they put it into their application, probably without validating it and not having any source control over it. Okay, this is the problem. This is a real problem, and nobody's talking about this. But it's a real problem. It's a real thing. So, again, I don't need to see a show of hands, but anybody who's ever used a third-party JavaScript, have you ever validated it? Have you ever even looked at the code? Few of you have, most of you haven't. I'm guessing that most people haven't. Again, you have no source control over this. At least if you downloaded it to your own server, you'd have a little bit of control over the code, knowing that it wouldn't change, knowing that you're not going to get hacked by somebody. And you've got no control over server configurations, and I'll show you an example too of somebody's bad server configuration really screwed up a lot of people's websites. The other thing here to remember is that even if you're just going off to one other domain to pick up your JavaScript, you know, you've doubled your chance of being hacked now, right? Because now you've got 2 websites that could be hacked. If you do it, you know, 6 or whatever, I mean, you're increasing your odds of having a security violation. Okay, so what are the threats? Specifically, what are the threats? Well, the first one would be something that I call bandwidth stealing. And for example, this is a little exercise somebody did here where you can, it's a URL shortener, basically what it is. And you can type in the link that you want shortened, and then you can type in a target, all right? So what happens with this URL shortener, if you use it, it'll do what it was designed to do. It'll shorten the URL and bring you someplace where that points to. But it also creates a little tiny iframe on your page that repeatedly goes off and hits the target. So what you're able to do with this is create a denial of service attack. It is rumored, I don't think anyone's ever proven this, but people are pretty certain that Anonymous used this technique when they brought down, I believe it was WikiLeaks. They brought down a couple of websites, and they did it through a URL shortener. And if you think about this, I mean, Anonymous probably has several million followers on Twitter. You start putting shortened URLs out on Twitter, you're going to get people clicking the link, right? And unknowingly, they're assisting in a distributed denial of service attack that was done by Anonymous. So there are definitely dangers in doing this kind of thing. The other thing is privacy violations. You know, anytime you allow a third party to do anything on your website, whether it's an image, certainly JavaScript, you are sharing your analytics with that domain. You understand that, right? Just as you would if you were doing a little snippet of code for Google to do your analytics. Just think of the analytics jQuery must have, or any of those really widely used libraries. So there are opportunities for privacy violations. And I said before too that the DOM is also something that can be monitored and changed. This is how the banking malware works. It'll just sit and it'll look for a form element. Maybe it's got a name, PW, PWD, password. As soon as it finds one of those, it'll start looking for a username. Next thing you know, it's stealing passwords. This stuff happens. This happens. The other one is phishing attempts, and this is probably my favorite. What would happen if, for example, you created a really nice tutorial for some very common JavaScript library. And let's say in your tutorial, you even gave people a place to download the code, or you can run it on their server. That'd be a pretty nice thing, right? If you look at this, whoops, get out of the way here. If you look at this URL, this is not the URL for analytics. This will take you someplace else. And this was a exploit that a lot of people fell for, and a lot of people thought they were running Google Analytics, when in fact they were just offering up their analytics to somebody who wanted it. The problem is you end up with arbitrary code running in your application. Sometimes that's a good thing. Normally it's a good thing, but it can be a bad thing. I told you before, sometimes you have issues with server configurations, and that's what this example is. There was I don't even want to say it was a bug, because this code was developed by a very competent developer. It was the file plugin for jQuery. And it allowed people to upload files safely. Just, it did exactly what it was intended to do. But it was dependent on a .htaccess setting in Apache. Well, somewhere along the line, Apache changed their defaults, or they changed the way that configuration worked, and it broke this jQuery plugin. So you can see there are a lot of dependencies here when you start using a lot of other people's code. And again, I'm not telling you not to use other people's code because we have to. You just need to be concerned about it. You need to be aware of things that are going on. Anyway, this was a huge exploit, and basically it allowed people to upload scripts or files, and they could execute them on the server. Nasty, nasty, nasty. I'm guessing that there's still repercussions of this happening. So even if you're using validated code, you don't control their server, and things can change on the server. Other attack vectors. Well, it could be part of somebody's deviant plan. I'm going to create the world's most popular JavaScript library, and then somewhere along the line, I'm going to change the code because I can, and I can make it do all kinds of evil things. Or maybe the repository gets hacked, right? We talked about that just a little bit. The more external resources you use, the more likely it is that someone's going to get hacked. If you're using DNS, or if there's DNS involved, you're looking at DNS poisoning, DNS spoofing. Also social engineering, like I showed in the previous example, where you set up a mirror that is your mirror. I should go back to the whole, well, I guess that's not applicable. Other things, you can have repositories that have actual bugs in them. You can have cross-site scripting issues. All the common exploits can happen if you're using remote software. Man in the middle. Here's something I see quite a bit, clear text API credentials. If you're using JavaScript to access an API that requires security, any kind of credentials, it's really hard to do that in JavaScript without showing people your passwords. Okay, again, I'm not telling you not to use these libraries. I use them, they're really important, they're really useful. What I'm asking is that you use them safely. So, one of the things you see a lot of people do is they download the library to their own server. And this eliminates all those DNS problems, it eliminates all of the remote network kind of hacking kind of things. You might be violating some license requirements if you do that, so you might want to check into that first. Also, there might be things that are happening in that JavaScript that are dependent on the server that they're running on. For example, I suspect Google Maps would be one of those because it's accessing a ton of data. But it does remove any DNS-related issues that you might have. The other thing you might want to do is take your JavaScript, and if possible, you can sandbox it in an iframe. And if you do that, it should protect you from any of those DOM, document object model exploits, because the iframe is not supposed to allow you to cross from frame to frame with JavaScript. So that's one solution. You might want to sandbox it. The other thing you might want to do is something called SRI, and this is something I don't have a lot of experience with. It's relatively new. What SRI does is what you do is you create a hash that corresponds to the library that you want to import, and if the imported library doesn't have this hash, it doesn't load. The bad thing about this is that this just became standard in all the popular browsers this year. So I suspect if someone's using an older browser, this would probably break, or it would probably load the file, but it probably wouldn't do the integrity check. The other thing that I really, really stress for people to do is if you have a corporate network, don't host your website on that network. It's really a bad idea. Because if anybody has an exploit that gives access to your network, you don't want it to be a corporate network with all your financials and HR stuff. So by all means, use a cheap $10 a month host. It's worth the money. The other thing you can do is you can track changes in the libraries, but that's kind of complex. That would require that you periodically download them and check them and do that kind of stuff. Basically, you're doing the SRI thing manually. It's an option. You could do it. The other thing you can do, and this is something I really would like people to do, is question if you need the functionality that you're importing. Because again, you saw that 1995 model, that actually works. It works really well, and it gives you a lot of control. So if you're just using an AJAX function to download some content in the middle of a page that you could have just as easily sent from the server anyway, you might want to do that. In fact, I see a lot of that. Sometimes I think they're doing that to keep people like me from screen scraping, but it doesn't work. So, question if you need the functionality that you're getting from the JavaScript. I also want to point out that JavaScript is not the only thing that can do this. Flash, PDFs, videos, images, they can all do this thing too. In fact, a couple years ago, in fact it was 10 years ago, I did another talk at DEF CON called The Fabulous Executable Image Exploit. And this is on YouTube if you want to take a look at it. It describes how you can create images that are actually executable code. And they can do anything that you can do with a regular script. Anything. They can access databases, they can write cookies, they can read cookies. I think maybe the most frightening thing that I demonstrated on this is that I can actually create an image that will execute JavaScript. It's possible. You can do it. Okay, so what have we learned? We learned that JavaScript is awesome, right? I don't want to scare people away from using JavaScript because it really is awesome. But I don't like the trends that I see. I don't like what people are doing with it. Source control is important in software development. If you don't control the software that people are using, you really don't have an app. A lot of developers are importing JavaScript that they don't actually control, and that's bad. Most developers don't validate imported libraries, and this is true. I saw a couple hands out here earlier. The vast majority of people, and you know who you are, you're not doing it. And these scripts can be used as attack vectors. That is the one thing that I really want to leave with you. Also, there are ways to minimize your risk. I'm not saying you're ever going to completely get rid of it, but you can minimize your risk. All right, thank you very much. I'll be around for questions. Also tomorrow, I'm also doing a talk on metadata. So if there's any related questions, I'd be happy to field those now. Nobody? Awesome. Otherwise, if you see me around, just stop me and I'll be more than happy to talk to you.
I do have one question. So you talk about validation, and what I'd like to know is what you mean by validation, because presumably what you want to be able to do is demonstrate that the library that you're using does exactly what you expect it to do and doesn't do anything else.
That is exactly it.
So how do you do that?
Well, that's a whole area of computer science, validating software and doing testing of software. And it is exactly what you said it is. You figure out specifically what you want your software to do and make sure it doesn't do anything else. That second part is the hard one. So if you're able to, look at the code, do a code review on it like you would within your group of developers. Just take out the JavaScript and take a look, see if it's doing something weird. I would certainly look for mentions of other domains. I'd look for other network connections it might be making. You might want to put NetShark or something on your network and just run the JavaScript to make sure it's not doing anything you don't want it to do, making access to things. But it's hard. That second part of it is really hard, because when you are testing your own software, you know what's in it. And let's say if you wrote a piece of financial software, you probably didn't intentionally put some malware in there to read other people's passwords when they're logging into their banks. But you don't know that that's not happening with the stuff you're downloading. So it's much, much harder to validate this kind of code than it is other people's code. Back in the day, when I was developing software for implantable medical devices, we didn't assume anything. Even the operating system in our devices, like we had external devices that programmed internal devices, and they all ran IBM OS2, if you remember that back in the day. In fact, today a lot of ATM machines still run OS2. And one of the reasons it was popular is because it was validated. And in fact, OS2 was approved by the EU and the FDA for use in medical devices. So we kind of had that going for us. But when you're using other people's software, you really don't have that option. You don't have that advantage. So it's, like I was trying to disprove earlier when I said web development is unique, it really is. Because you're kind of developing in a land where you don't have as much control as you would if you were just doing a standalone application. And by standalone, I mean like something that is not connected to a network. Anybody else? All right, you guys have been awesome. Like I said, if you see me around, don't be afraid to stop. And I'll be around tomorrow morning to do that metadata talk. Thank you very much.